Hi everybody, welcome to Homes in 719. This video is all about appraisal gaps. And if you haven't watched the video on escalation clauses, I recommend you go do that first because these two pieces typically work together really well. They don't have to, but typically they do. And in this video, because they can be used separately, I'm going to discuss and reference some of the stuff from the first video in this one, so it might help you understand the two pieces a little bit better together. My name is Chris Wojciechowski. I am a realtor and broker owner of Homes in 719. And in recent years here, appraisal gaps and escalations have gotten really crazy. So I thought I'd do a video about it so that I don't forget how they work later as the market shifts too. But these two pieces are really, really hard to explain to most consumers. And is another reason why I split these two apart to try to break them down into smaller pieces. They are very important because you're going to put them into a contract and you're going to be held legally binding to them. So it's imperative that you do understand how these work together. And I'm going to do my best to try to put it in a video and show you some diagrams so you have a chance to understand how these pieces work together and what your real risk is. All right, so the values that I'm using in here are just examples that I used in the previous video. The purchase price and all that can change based on your scenario. But let's take a look at the previous scenario that we utilized, okay? So we had a couple things that we were doing. So first we had the buyer wanted to pay this $300,000 number, and then they would pay up to $350,000, and the escalation, we had it configured to do in $2,000 increments. So what happened was we put in an offer. Our original offer was at $300,000, right? And then we had a competing offer that was at $305,000. So that caused our escalation to trigger and increased our purchase price up to $306,000. So that's what our purchase price, and that's a very key term, purchase price is, and that's our new offer amount. Purchase price. There we go. So that's important. So what's going to happen from this point forward is the offer is going to go in. Let's presume it got accepted. We've gone through inspection, all that kind of stuff, and the lender has requested an appraisal on this property. And in the first example we're going to use here is that the appraisal came back at $306,000, which is the purchase price of the contract. Remember, our offer was originally $300,000, but it was escalated to $306,000. And in this first example, the appraisal came back at $306,000. That's perfect because that locks everything in. There's no deviation. The lender is going to lend at $306,000, the full amount of the purchase price. So that's nice and clean. In this case, it runs kind of like a normal transaction. Nothing really changes. All right. Where it gets a little muddier is where the purchase price or the appraisal comes back lower than the purchase price at $306,000. So let's say that it comes in at $302,000. All right. Because of the language, and I'm going to get into that in a minute and walk you through it, because of the language of the escalation and appraisal gap, if the appraisal came back at $302,000, well, now we've got a little bit of an issue. We've got a shortage. The seller is not required to sell the property for less than the purchase price. So now we have the lender saying, we're not going to give you more than $302,000. So there's a $4,000 difference here. And because of the escalation and appraisal gap clauses that are added, the seller in this point would expect the buyer to bring $4,000 more to the table. They're going to have to fill that gap between 302 and 306. So I want to do a couple numbers here real quick and just kind of show you how the numbers work. So in the first example where I said 306,000, Let's say we had 306,000 and your lender was requiring you to bring 5% down. That would mean you got to bring $5,300 to the table to close. Okay. Now, in this example, at 302,000, in the second example, 302,000, they're only going to lend 302,000. You still got to bring 5% to the table. So now you got to bring 5,100. But we've got a $4,000 shortage here that you are required and you agreed in the terms and conditions to bring to the table. So you're actually going to have to bring 4,000 more to go from 302 to 306, which means you're going to have on hand and available to you $19,100 at closing, plus any other stuff. That's just an estimate, okay? There's other expenses that can kind of play into this. But what happens if the appraisal comes back not at 302,000, but 298,000? Well, that's a lot less, right? Let's just run the numbers here, and then I'm going to get you into the text. So we're going to say 298,000 times 5%. That means we got to bring $14,900 in down payment money. But now we've got a $8,000 shortage. Does that mean you got to bring $8,000 to the table? Well, it could, but not in this case. So let's pause here for a minute on these two, on the numbers and the chart. And we're going to go look at the clauses that the appraisal gap adds to the contract to help define what happens if. All right. So let's go up here. We're going to go up, take a look at this first clause that's here on the screen. It says 6.2. Buyer may only terminate or object to 6.2.1, and both those numbers are referring to sections of the contract to buy sell, also known as the offer, okay? If the difference between the appraised value and the purchase price is more than $6,000, right? So what we need to have if we go back to the first example where the appraisal came back at 306,000, we have no issue. The lender's going to lend 306,000. Everything is going to go through just fine. In the second example, we had a difference between the appraised value and the purchase price of $4,000, not $6,000. So the buyer cannot object to the appraisal. Cannot. You are locked in, and you must bring that extra $4,000 to closing, right? So that means you're going to have to bring that $19,100 to closing to be valid in this contract. And if you're not, the seller can sue you for performance, not abiding by the contract, okay? So that's why it's very important to understand how this clause is structured, because if you only have that 15,300, right? Or 15,000, yeah, you have 15,300, but you don't have the 19,000. Well, you can't even use this. You're gonna have to get the money from somewhere, and you can't just get it from anywhere either. That has very specific rules from the lender on where money can come from to be used as a down payment. So you need to talk to your lender and make sure you understand exactly where all this money is coming from, so it's coming from a valid source. All right. But let's go into what happens if it's 298,000, right? We didn't really get into that yet. So if the appraised value comes in at 298,000 and your purchase price in your offer due to the escalation is at 306,000, well, now we've got an $8,000 buffer, right? We got an $8,000 difference. Well, that means you can object to the appraisal in that case, and you can try to renegotiate the terms. And that's why it's really important in your offer to define that first number, like how much risk, how much do you want to put on the table that you have, because you want to cap that so it doesn't get crazy. If you take that completely out, you're open for anything. If the offer went to 350,000, you'd have to bring it to the table to make the difference. All right. So it's very, very important to have that right. In the second clause here, it says if the difference between the purchase price in this case, it's $306,000, and the appraised value is less than $6,000, buyer shall have no right to terminate. That's what I said before, right? In the second example, if the appraised value came in at $302,000, you have no right to terminate, no right to object. You got to bring the money to the table. In the third sentence, buyer acknowledges that the appraised value less than the purchase price may require the buyer to bring additional cash to closing to offset any deficit. And that's exactly what I was talking about. If you're at 302, you're going to have to bring that $4,000 to the table. Period. It forces that number to 306, and the seller's really happy because they know how much money they're getting, and you have no right to object to the appraisal unless it's greater than $6,000, right? And then it goes on to state a little bit more. Buyer further acknowledges that any termination by the buyer under 5.2 loan termination, which is a different section of the contract, cannot be based on appraised value, including any requirements that the buyer bring additional cash to closing as a result of the appraised value being lower than the purchase price. So what happens there is, right, this first sentence and that second sentence kind of work together. And we need to make sure that we dial those in so that you don't get caught not being able to object to the appraisal when it gets out of hand, right? So these clauses that we can add, not required to add, but if you as the buyer request of the agent to add stuff like that, we have the tools to do that. We can add some additional parameters or terms to the offer to make it, in this case, is more enticing. Back when the seller's market was crazy hot here in Colorado Springs, and I would say somewhat 20, 21, and 22, really in 21, most agents would tell the seller one of the most important sections is this appraisal gap. The bigger that number was, the more importance that offer had. Because it really didn't matter. What a agent could do, a buyer's agent could do, is they could go and say, hey, we're going to put in this really big stupid number as the original purchase price, and the appraisal gap might be $6,000. Let's just keep it clean for us, right? That $350 doesn't really come into play then, unless the appraisal comes in at $350. If the appraisal comes in again at $302, right? Well, then the buyer is only got to bring that $6,000 more to the table. That's all they got. That's all they're locked into. So you can make it $350, $400, $500, $600, $1 million. It didn't really matter what the original purchase price was based on the escalation and appraisal gap, because it really kind of capped that. So if you wanted to throw down and have a bigger escalation number, say $350, and you wanted it to be effective, you really needed to have a big appraisal gap number in there to almost cap it, or make sure you could get to the $350, and to make it effective for the seller. And another thing that kind of happened, that this is more of a recent thing, some lenders were allowing appraisal waivers. And in that case, where your full escalated purchase price that you have in the offer and your appraised value or your appraisal gap cap is equal to that, sometimes the lender would go ahead, it was case-by-case basis, by address. The lender would say, hey, this property is eligible for an appraisal waiver, and you didn't need an appraisal at all. So that restructured everything. It's kind of a different scenario in which the escalation really could be in there, but the appraisal gap might not be in there, and you don't have to worry so much about it. But every scenario is different, and you need to make sure you're talking to your agent. And if your agent can't clearly explain it to you, you need to talk to the agent's boss or somebody else to figure out how they can explain this to you so you understand your full risks of using an escalation and an appraisal gap on an offer, because it can get quite muddy, and they're all legally binding. Even if you don't understand it, it's still legally binding, and the seller can hold you accountable to it. So make sure you understand all your risks and obligations in the offer, especially on any additional clauses that are added in the additional provisions in the contract. If you have questions, comments about this, I'd love to see them down in the chat. Thank you for watching. Hopefully you found this useful. And if you didn't watch the escalation video, you probably need to go back and watch that now, because it's going to help you maybe even have to come back and watch this again just to get all the pieces moving together. Thanks again. You need help networking with a realtor, feel free to reach out to us here at homesand719.com. The phone number is right up there. So thanks again for watching. Have a good day. Bye.